We'll try that. Put everything on top of it. I already had it open. Look at that. All right. So this morning we are moving forward in our study of Leviticus. We are entering into some of those more difficult chapters to read and to understand as far as the purpose for us, as far as the purpose for Christians today. Chapters 11 through 15 deal with clean and unclean things. Starting in chapter 11, the things that are clean and unclean concerning the diet of the Israelites or of the Jews, and also including the handling of dead things. Chapter 12 has to do with the cleanliness of a mother after giving birth. Chapters 13 and 14 address the unclean disease of leprosy, both the diagnosis and the treatment of it. And then finally, chapter 15 has to do with cleanliness regarding bodily functions. So these are things that when we hear about, and if you just kind of read through these things, you're going to be like, oh, why do I need to read this? Why do I need to know this kind of stuff? And I mentioned when we started the book of Leviticus that it's very easy to get bogged down in the minutiae and in the details and questioning why these things are written, why they're here for us. But our goal is to find Jesus even in the book of Leviticus. Because for us, there is reason to study, read, and to meditate upon the book of Leviticus, because guess what? It is part of God's living, active word. It doesn't say that the Old Testament is dead for New Testament believers. There is no cause for us to just forget about those Old Testament books. It is all part of God's living and active word. And if it's living and active, that means it's relevant for us. So we had begun this series with the idea of focusing on living Leviticus in 2024. And we saw in the first several chapters of it all the offerings and such. And although the offerings have ceased, we saw a picture of Christ in the offerings. We also saw that we were called to live our lives as a living sacrifice before the Lord. We saw also the last few chapters we studied things concerning the Aaronic priesthood. Well, we know that priesthood has such since ceased, but we still found Christ in that priesthood. And we also found for us that we are called a royal generation or a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. We are to serve as priests before the Lord. So everything that we have studied so far in Leviticus applies to us still thousands of years later. Even though a lot of the principle of it was written directly initially for the people of Israel, we can find purpose in it. And these chapters ahead that we're facing, 11 through 15, are no different. We will find in chapter 11, which is where we're going to start today, we will find Christ within that. We will also find a message for us in there, even though it was written specifically to the Israelites that many years ago. Now, I mentioned that this chapter has to do with clean and unclean things concerning the Jews' diet and how they're to handle dead things. And I found it kind of interesting that, when we were in chapter 10 just a week or so ago, one of the responsibilities of the priest is stated in verse 10, and it says, and that ye may put difference between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean. So one of the responsibilities of the priest were to let the people know and help them to determine what is clean and what is unclean. So God gives the instruction, and then the priests are to help the people to follow those instructions. Now, although this was written for the Jews at a specific time, it is something that we consider and we think about these dietary restrictions. Are they still applicable to us today? Well, in the New Testament, Jesus himself put a lot of this away. Said that it is no longer what goes into a man's body that makes him clean or unclean, but what comes out. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 11, it says, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. And then in verses 16 through 20, it says, and Jesus said, are you also yet without understanding? Do you not understand that whatsoever entereth in the mouth goeth into the belly, and is cast out in the draught? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, theft, false witness, blasphemy. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. So Jesus has said that what we put into our mouths, that doesn't make us clean or unclean. When Peter has that vision, and it's recorded, I think, in Acts chapter 10, God comes to Peter in this vision, and he brings down this sheet full of all manners of animals and creeping things. And he tells Peter, kill and eat. And Peter looks around and he sees these things that ceremonially are unclean. Those things that had previously been called by God unclean. And he tells God, he says, no, I've never eaten any unclean thing, and now I never will. And the Lord spoke and said, what God hath cleansed, call thou not common or unclean. So those things that were previously unclean, God has now said they're clean. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, in verse 8, but meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. So the idea of this Levitical diet that is given to the people of Israel is no longer for us. There are things that we read about in that list that you can read yourselves that we would go, oh man. One thing that is strictly prohibited was pork. Now, I don't know about you, but I love me some barbecue. And man, the last 3 Saturdays, Sally and I have gone out to breakfast, and we have gotten some bacon that was oh so good. Some of the things under the water that they're prohibited to eat is any kind of shellfish. I like me some clams and some lobster tail and some crab legs now and then. And fortunately, we're not under those restrictions. We are able to eat that stuff today. But we're still going to study it because it is still relative to us. It is still something that we can learn from because it is part of God's living, active word. So, chapter 11 is 47 verses, but we are not going to read all 47 verses. We're going to read the first 4 verses that kind of get us going, talks about clean and unclean, and then we're going to jump to the end, and we're going to look at verses 44 through 47. So let's begin this morning. We're going to look at verses 1 through 4. That kind of gets us set up and gets us going. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, these are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever parteth the hoof, and is cloven foot, and cheweth the cud, among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Nevertheless, these shall not eat them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, as the camel, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. So we've already established there are things that are clean that they're allowed to eat, and there are things that are unclean that they are not allowed to eat. So before we jump to the end here, this clean and unclean listing continues. It continues with sea creatures. It talks about things that have fins and scales. Those are things you can eat. But anything else, you're not allowed to. And like I said, that includes clams and mussels and, all the crustaceans and things like that. They weren't permitted to eat any of that. It goes on and then addresses creatures that fly. There are birds that even today we don't eat. Eagles, falcons, things of that nature, and buzzards. And, there are a lot of things that fly that we are not permitted to eat. But there are some that they were then. It goes on from things that fly to handling things that are dead. Now, this can include things that are ceremonially clean. They can find a bull that is dead, but they're not permitted to touch it or handle it or anything of that nature, even though that's an animal that they would be permitted to eat. But if it dies, it becomes unclean. Now, if they kill it, that's different. So it talks about that, and then it goes on and talks about things that are swarming animals, things like mice, things like lizards, which we don't really think of that much today. But then we're given, at the end, we jump to verse 44, and we see why the people of Israel are to follow these instructions that God has given concerning their diet and handling of dead things. So jump ahead, we're going to look at verse 44 through 47. For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, for I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl and every living creature that moveth in the water and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. So what we start with here is this declaration that's made by God to them. This is a declaration concerning those things that are clean and unclean. So what are some of the things we can observe about clean and unclean that are here in Leviticus? First, clean and unclean has to do primarily here with food. It deals secondarily with cleanliness that is a result of contact with a dead animal. But it seems the reason that the dead animal is called unclean is because it died and it's not prepared properly to be eaten. Even a clean animal, bull or sheep, cannot be eaten if it were not killed in a proper manner. So it has to do with food or that which is touched when dead. Second, clean or unclean is a matter of category more than of condition. When we talk about being clean, we generally speak of a condition someone is in. If the children come in the house and they're unclean, then they need to get their hands washed or whatever the case may be. But their category is that of still being a child. But their condition is one of being dirty. But when we talk about things like a used car, if it says that a car is clean, they're not talking necessarily about the condition of the car, or they are talking about the condition rather, not the category. Because when you're talking about cars, the category would be things like it's a convertible, it's a sports car, it's a truck, whatever. But the condition of it would be considered clean, low miles, in good condition, things like that. But clean here is a categorical pronouncement. It is all the animals that chew their cud, have split hooves, whether their hooves have been washed or not. The category that they're speaking of is clean or unclean, depending on the classification of the creature that it's talking about. Third, cleanliness is that which is defined by God and declared by the priest. Clean or unclean is clean or unclean by definition, and the definition for clean and unclean gets to be defined by who? By God. And then it is, of course, declared by the priest. Fourth, clean or unclean has to do with our state of access to God. If a priest was declared unclean for some reason, and jumping way ahead like Leviticus 22, there's reference there to a priest not being able to enter into the Holy of Holies because he has been deemed unclean. And there's a prescribed process of cleansing and a waiting period and all that before he is permitted to go back in to the presence of God. So whether we are clean or unclean affects our fellowship with God as well. Now, cleanliness seems to be somehow related to holiness. Have you ever heard the statement that cleanliness is next to godliness? Can somebody please tell me the scriptural reference for cleanliness is next to godliness? Well, there isn't one. But cleanliness is associated with holiness here in Leviticus. When we get down to the basic reason why an Israelite is to make these distinctions between clean and unclean is because God says, you are to be holy. Why? Because I am holy. For the first time in history, the first time in the Old Testament, men and women are to observe these distinctions because God has made them. Cleanliness is related to God's holiness, and Israel is to observe it because of the holiness of God. It's repeated twice in this chapter that they are to be holy because He is holy. Whatever God has declared as clean is clean. Whatever He has declared as unclean is unclean. So we can make some reasoning here. We can make some deductions here, or people have in the past, as to the purpose of this dietary restriction that is given. There are a few different schools of thought concerning why Israel was told that you can eat this but not that. One of the first ones that comes into mind is that some of the creatures that are forbidden, that are declared as unclean, are animals that would have been used in pagan sacrifices and practices. So they say that the reason that those animals are deemed unclean is because God does not want anything that would be used in a pagan sacrifice to be used in the worship of Him, the one true God. Well, there's a problem with that thinking. Bulls were often used as sacrificial animals, even in pagan worship. And yet, what is one of the primary things that is offered to God? The bull. So I don't think that is an adequate definition or reason behind God giving all these restrictions. The other one is a hygienic explanation. This is one that I've heard many, many times, and one that a lot of Christians have just come to accept. When we read about some of the animals that are forbidden for them to eat, we think about it from a modern day perspective. And we think, man, could you imagine eating pork back then, not knowing that pork has to be brought to a certain temperature to kill those worms that crawl in its flesh and everything? Did you know that there was no proper refrigeration back then to keep things? So maybe that's why God gave them all these provisions and told them that these things were clean and these things were unclean, because it had to do with health and sanitary reasons. And in our minds, we want to accept that. We think, hey, that makes perfectly good sense. You know, when you think about the seafood out there, that if not cooked properly, can be like poison to us. When you think about those birds that eat the flesh, eat decaying flesh, and we think, man, that just makes good common sense. I wouldn't eat that. And we think this has got to be the reason why God chose to do that. Why then in the New Testament does Jesus say it's not what comes into the body that's clean or unclean? Why is Peter told, eat, kill and eat, don't call anything unclean that I have said is clean? Why did it change? Did all of a sudden they have proper cooking instructions? Did the recipe book come out that said this is how you shall prepare pork and shellfish and such? No. Was refrigeration made available? No. So why the change? So I don't think it is a hygienic reason that God did this. Although we can see reason in it, I don't think that's God's reasoning. So what is God's reasoning for giving this? How about just God is sovereign? How about God has decided what is clean and what is unclean for his people? How about the fact that even in God's choice of Israel, we can't make sense of it? Was Israel somehow better people, more godly people than the Canaanites? Did God choose them because they were just a perfect people? No. God chose them because God is sovereign. And he chose whom he wanted to choose. Why did God hate Esau but love Jacob? Because God's sovereign. It's his choice to make. There is nothing intrinsically evil about one food choice over the other. But we know this, that God chose one to be clean and one to be unclean. It seems to me that his sovereignty, while it may not explain it all, at least gives us meaning when nothing else seems to fit. It was just God's choice. God said he chose Jacob, rejected Esau. Why? Because sovereign choices are sovereign choices. They don't have to have reason. Election that we talk about concerning salvation. Why does God choose one man to salvation and not another? Is one man less evil than others? I'll tell you what, if it was based on sin and he said, oh, that one sinned too much, I'm not going to choose him, I know I wouldn't be here. So it's God's sovereign election, as well as the salvation of Israel. So it's God's sovereignty that explains why he did what he did. And it's not an explanation that we can reason with and understand, but it's one I think we can accept. But now, is this distinction, this setting apart of his people, something that is maintained yet today? These laws that were given to Israel were given to them specifically to set them apart. They were to be holy because God is holy. For I am the Lord your God, therefore you shall sanctify yourselves. What does sanctify mean? Set apart. Set apart from who? Well, they're living among the Canaanites. The Canaanites, they'll eat anything. Anything. Doesn't matter if they find it on the side of the road dead. They will eat it. This sets Israel apart from them. And what is the purpose of setting them apart from the Canaanites and doing it through food? Well, think about when most fellowship takes place, most joining together, most coming together of a family happens. It's around the dinner table. Think also about the fact that even though they were living among the Canaanites and the Canaanites were living among them, what God told them not to do, don't intermarry. Don't take them to be your sons and your daughters. Well, if a wedding's planned, there's going to be food there, isn't there? And the Israelites have been given all these restrictions about what they can eat. It's a way of setting them apart from the Canaanites. They were to be set apart by the way they lived. Verse 45 says, "For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." It is to make a distinction between them and the other people of the land. They are set apart by this diet that they have to observe. They don't blend in because of that. Now, I mentioned that our goal was to see Jesus in this passage. And Jesus came in the image of a man, but he was set apart for the purpose of God, to provide us atonement. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8 says, "Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." Even though he was among men and appeared as a man, he was set apart. Jesus, I don't know if you know this, Jesus was a Jew. And he obeyed every law of God, even those concerning dietary restrictions. Because if he would have not done that, he would have been breaking the law of God, therefore he would have been sinning, and when he died on the cross, he would have died for his own sins and not ours. Today, as in times past, there's this powerful pull from the world, this desire to be accepted and adored by the world. And even the word different has been used to this end. It's cool to be different, right? We say, "Oh, look at my hair, look at my clothes, look at what I can do." But so often our desire to be different is not to be set apart, but to stand out and to rise above. God does not want us to be different as an end to itself or for our own glory. That's not being different. That's not being set apart. That's simply conforming to a rebellious, misguided, me-centered, and ultimately deadly way of the world. This is why the Apostle Peter, in his first letter, encourages his readers by quoting from Leviticus chapter 11. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 16, it says, "As obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as he which has called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. Because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy." So what can we do? We are no longer bound by these dietary restrictions that were designed to set God's people apart. So what can we do to be set apart? Well, we can start by first trusting in Christ, cleansing our hearts at the cross, coming to him and admitting that we are corrupt, we are defiled by sin, we are unclean, and that we would seek his forgiveness and accept his grace. We can ask God to help us to live each day for an audience of one, not doing it for the attention and praise of men, but for doing it for the glory of God. Help us to walk in a manner that displays God in our lives. We can read his word, meditate, pray according to his word, and help us to be around people that help us to live sanctified lives. So is there still a connection for people today when it comes to rules about food? Actually, there is one. And it's written by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. It says this, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Verse 45 reminds us, "For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." God brought his people out of the slavery of Egypt to be their God. And because of that, they are to be holy because he is holy. Now, God has brought us out from slavery as well. Not the slavery of Egypt, but the slavery of sin. He has done this so that he could be our God. He gave us his only begotten Son to set us free so that we could be in relationship with God the Father. Therefore, be ye holy, because the Lord God, he is holy. We are to be set apart not by the food we eat, not by the clothes we wear, not by the color of our hair, by what Christ has done in us, by the righteousness of Christ living in us and being displayed through us. We are not removed from the world, but we are to be set apart, sanctified in the world, that people would see that we are different. Not to our glory, but to the glory of God. Let's stand for a word of prayer, shall we? Lord, we thank you for your word this morning. Help us, Lord, to live lives that are set apart, sanctified. Help us, Lord, to be holy, not in self-righteousness, but by the righteousness of Christ, because, Lord, you are holy. Amen.